Welcome back to the Auto Obsessive Garage and yet another installment of Project Show Me the Sleeper. On this episode, we're going to go ahead and remove that intake manifold. Our objective is to check our valve shims, which should be checked to make sure they're within tolerance every 60,000 miles. We're also going to slap on a new valve cover gasket. Even though it's not leaking, it's a great idea to do it while you're in there. And we're going to replace that intake manifold gasket. There should be two gaskets, main gaskets we need to replace, and I'm sure those have never been touched. Just as sure as I am that intake manifold has never been off the car. We're also going to give the intake manifold a nice little paint job, something quick and easy to make it look as nice as it should. Sounds like we need to get inside the garage and get to work. Let's do it. Since we're doing the full 60K service on this, which includes spark plugs down in there, we really need to get the intake manifold off the vehicle. So the first step in that process is going ahead and removing your intake box and everything connected to your throttle body. It's always a good practice too, I use my high visibility tape here, to mark anything you disconnect, any vacuum lines, any electrical connectors, and just kind of write where they go. Makes it a lot easier since we're going to be disconnecting a lot of stuff up here. Next up, we're going to remove the throttle cable and cruise control. Two 10mm bolts right here. There's the clip removed for the cruise control. There you go, and you have the whole throttle cable and cruise control assembly here. Go ahead and just move that out of the way to give yourself some more room to work. Next, we want to disconnect the various vacuum lines. There's two coming off either side of the throttle body, and then there's a coolant line underneath. So I went ahead and labeled those already. Let's start removing. Oh. Yeah, as you can see, these hoses are just brittle. I'm going to go ahead and replace the gnarlier looking ones. These are pretty standard vacuum hoses, and you know, if they break in half just by pulling them off like that, we don't want to rely on those holding vacuum pressure. So looks like we'll redo some vacuum lines while we're in here too. Now before we drop this lower one here, which is a coolant line one, make sure you have some kind of drip pan underneath. Let's go ahead and back these vacuum lines off nice and easy. Well, correction, those were 3 coolant lines on the bottom, not air. Good thing I had my drip pan handy. So you're probably gonna lose a lot more coolant out of this bottom one, but these are also coolant lines. This is your secondary runner box here. You want to disconnect this electrical connector right here. Like so. And definitely go ahead and slap some tape on there with a label. Now if you weren't doing the timing belt at the same time, you'd have obviously an upper timing belt cover, a little crossover section for the intake manifold. That's gone now because I am doing the timing belt and water pump. So your DIS would be here. You need to obviously disconnect these 2 items from it. And there's also a vacuum line that connects right here. So go ahead and pop that right off. Just like that. And then we certainly want to get this large connection back here. So let's go ahead and pull that off at this time. Let that lubricator go to work. Just like that. Love that stuff. Okay, now it's time to actually start loosening the bolts that hold the intake manifold to the engine head. First one you want to start with is hidden right back here. There we go. So it's kind of a tricky one to get to. It's a 15mm here, and then this will spin sometimes, this nut back here. So you do want to hold this with a 19mm open wrench. Let's go ahead and take that one off first. It's just hard to get a good angle on it, so I wanted to show you guys where it's located. So let's start off, get your 19 and your 15. Let's do it. So I think you actually need a deep 15 to get back there, but let's test it out and see. And get this 12mm that's holding the bracket right here to the intake manifold. It's hidden right under this opening. We'll continue the theme with these 12mm bolts. There's 2 on these brackets. Go ahead and take those off. Then there's one last one that's kind of hidden. The best way to find it is just go below this little connection right here. You can see it connecting right there. This needs to come off, which means you need to also disconnect this little connector back here, which should be just a little pop off, yep. And then disconnect these 2 bolts right here. So there was a gasket there. It might be worth sourcing another gasket just to be 100% safe. There is a connector here for the spark plug wire, so go ahead and pop these all out. You don't want to be pulling your wires out when you lift this intake manifold off. That should be fine. All right, time to remove the rest of the bolts holding the actual intake manifold to the head of the engine. There are a bunch of 10 millimeters. Make sure you get all those out. And you have one more 12 millimeter bolt waiting right here for us. Yes! There we go! Oh boy, she has some carbon. Also gonna take both these valve covers off and clean them up really nice. Cool, now you can seal our plugs, wires, which we'll be doing. Good stuff. Now what you wanna do is go ahead, pick off the old intake manifold gasket. Remember, you don't want anything falling down into these runners. It's fine to spray carb cleaner, and that's what we're actually gonna do and get some of that carbon out. But yeah, we've got brand new intake ones. These are pretty rough looking. The new intake gaskets will help a lot. So basically what I did to clean these up was to use a metal wire brush and some carb cleaner and really got in there and got all that carbon out. I mean, it was caked in there pretty thick. No sense in putting all this back together. You guys know how I am. We're not gonna do a job like this and leave all that carbon. Now I need to do the back bank if you need a reminder of how bad. I mean, it just looks like it's dark, but trust me, that is just thick carbon. You can see it around the flange there, so. We're gonna clean that up too. The whole intake manifold is gonna be cleaned. I like putting stuff together really clean, and it'll definitely help performance. Let's get the rear of the engine cleaned up too. All done cleaning up these rear intake ports. Let's go ahead and see how they look. Way better. No more of that nasty carbon. Awesome. Job well done. We're then removing both valve covers, and we're gonna do valve cover gaskets. And we got the plugs and wires, and while we're under there, since we're exposing the valves, we're going to do the valve shims. Make sure they're still within tolerance, and if they are out of tolerance, we'll replace them. It's part of the 60K service on the Ford Taurus SHO, so we'll make sure to knock that out. So let's clean up that intake manifold first, and then put something over your ports like I did here, so you prevent any foreign materials from falling down in there. Alright, we have the intake manifold flipped over here so you can see what kind of carbon we're dealing with. It's really hard to tell in this lighting, even though we're outdoors, so we'll get a flashlight. And boy, look down in there. We are dealing with a serious carbon buildup in this intake manifold. So we're going to clean this extensively and just get all of that out there. That's just performance robbing carbon buildup, guys. So we're going to do that for every one of these intake runners. This engine's gonna have a new lease on life when we're done with it. So let's get in there, do some carbon scrubbing, guys. Here we go. All done cleaning the carbon out of all these intake runners. It's actually looking pretty good. The next phase is gonna be wire wheeling and sanding down the intake manifold to repaint, since it does have some pretty nasty flaking going on, but how awesome does this look? Nice and cleaned up. Hey, I think we'll pick up a few extra ponies that we lost along the way. Looking good, guys. Let's give it a fresh coat of paint. As you can see, we've got our cleaned up valve covers back in place. Valve cover gaskets on there, everything's installed. But what you're also probably wondering is how we skipped ahead to this step. I bought a new video camera recently, got a new memory card in there, and basically lost, due to the memory card failing, lost a good 2 days of filming. So what we failed to see was the valve shims being tested, where I used a feeler gauge, went through every one of them to make sure they were within tolerance. Luckily every one of them was, so there wasn't too much footage lost there, but it is a good process. Very easy to do, guys. Still bummed I lost it. And then I put the valve cover gasket in, which There were no leaks around the perimeter of each valve cover, but on the rear one there were some around the spark plug wells. So there's little circles that go here. Also, clean your valve covers off the car. It's so much easier. So they cleaned up pretty good. There's some little peeling here. I thought about repainting, but at this point I'm not going to really do that. Now, taking off these little Allen bolts that hold the valve cover on, I did start to get some of this cheap material chipping around it, so that kind of stinks. You probably can replace those, but it's not that big of a deal. It all goes under that beautiful intake plenum anyway, so no big issue there. Ah, it's such a bummer, man. It's like so much footage was lost. It just said it was corrupted. I couldn't recover it. I tried a bunch of ways, so sorry for that, guys. There are some really good guides online, and you didn't miss much. Valve cover gaskets, not anything super fun, and checking all the shims, whatever. But it's cleaned up nice. Everything's back on. We don't have any leaks. New valve cover gaskets are in, front and rear. Another big tip, when you take these valve covers off, if it's been a while and there's lots of debris in the car, you always want to leave your spark plugs in the well, just because when you pull these valve covers on, something's probably going to fall down in there. So it's just to make sure it stays nice and clean. You don't want to risk anything falling down into your engine. And we're about to put our new plug wires and plugs in. Let's go ahead and do that step now. Here are our spark plugs. Go ahead and get these installed. Let's go ahead and check these gaps first. So the plugs for the SHO should be in the range of 0.042 to 0.046, measuring that gap. You never want to assume your plugs are correct, so go ahead and get your plug, get your measuring tool, and let's see what we're at here on this one right out of the box. 0.042, and that's exactly where we want to be. Make sure you do that for all your plugs, and you should be in business. So let's go ahead and install these in the car now. After, of course, we pull the old ones out. I do reckon these are the original spark plugs that came with the vehicle. So I am the first one to be in there. They're looking okay, actually, truth be told. Let's compare it to a new one. Now that's how you can tell a plug is pretty old. So if you're looking at the actual length of the tip here, look how much it's worn down on this original plug. So yeah, really worn down there. And then if you bring in the new one here, you can see all that healthy plug length on there. So great time to replace them. It probably wasn't getting the best spark ever. So this should definitely pick up the car quite a bit. Alright, time to place these spark plugs in. So after finding out the plug wires that I purchased are not going to work, I did look up the OEM ones. They're very hard to find and very expensive. Now there are some aftermarket options, but most of those are out of stock too. So there are some cheap alternatives out there, but for me, I don't know. I had no issues with spark, so there's no reason to really replace these. I'd rather run the OEMs in good condition, even though they're kind of old, versus cheap new ones. That's just my opinion, so I'm just going to go ahead and clean all the contacts for these ends and the end that goes to the spark plug, and then just reuse those. Time to put the plug wires back on. Now make sure you route them the same way they were routed before. It's going to make installing that intake manifold a lot easier. Remember, your higher numbers are here in the front, lower numbers are back here. Pretty straightforward. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Time to drop down our intake manifold. Double check you removed everything blocking these ports. Put the new intake manifold gaskets down, which we're going to do next. And then my plan is to set the intake manifold down where it rests and then connect all the vacuum lines, everything that goes under it, before we bolt it down. That way it still has some wiggle room. So let's go ahead and take care of that. Let's put these gaskets in first. Or with these mating surfaces completely cleaned and ready to receive the intake manifold again, let's go ahead and place our gaskets down. No kind of RTV or anything here, guys, just straight up gasket. Perfect, great fit. Now let's bring that intake manifold over. I should say our shiny, new painted and cleaned up intake manifold. So we're gonna try to rest it down where it's supposed to go. That went surprisingly well. That never happens. So it looks like it lines up pretty good. Now, like I said, I'm gonna go ahead and start reconnecting all the vacuum lines and everything before I bolt it down so I can still tilt it a little bit. Another thing you want to do, take a flashlight and ensure that your intake manifold gasket is still in place. With this shifting around, you don't want to risk having that kink or push out of shape. Yeah, perfect. Let's go ahead and continue connecting vacuum lines. Now, one of the more challenging things to do once you get your intake manifold back on here is these little air valves under here that have, you can kind of see down in here that there's a connector going to it. You're going to use pliers and a screwdriver to kind of push that under all these intake runners, and then you're going to use, like I said, yeah, a long screwdriver helps to kind of weave all this stuff under through. You don't want to run your vacuum lines over, kind of destroys the beauty of the engine. And then as you can see even more clearly here in the back, you can see that hose going in right there. That's the challenge. So you're going to need long needle nose pliers, and you're gonna stick that back on there. Boy, everything's always a little harder going back in than it was coming out, but this is looking pretty dang good.